This is another archival upload of some of my previous mix critique videos. I apologize for the vertical format that this video is about to switch to. This is 301 to 305. This mix was sent in by Scott. Definitely about to change up. This is clearly just the intro, but drums are way too loud. Vocals are not cutting through enough. And dude, the vocals aren't good. Like, they're really pitchy. They're whiny. It's not a good vocal sound. And that, I don't know if that's really a mix thing. That might just be the singer, but the vocals need a lot of work. You say I'm not right, but I don't hear you love to. All right, when everything else kicks in, the bass is also too loud. Basically, your whole rhythm section's too loud. You've definitely also boosted like the really far top end, like probably like 8K and up. You've boosted that way too much. And you probably have a little too much sub frequencies going on as well. It's just feeling a little boomy in the low end. That could be fixed by just bringing the volume of the kick drum and the bass down a bit, but more than likely you boosted too many sub frequencies as well. I'm being honest, I can't look at you the same. All right, man, honestly, the tones overall aren't bad, at least as far as the instruments go. It's mostly a balance thing. You have certain things turned up too loud, like the drums and the bass are definitely too loud. You're definitely pushing certain frequency ranges too far in the EQ. Like, we have a little too much in the low end. That's probably, again, partially the level of the kick drum and the bass. But the top end, you've definitely boosted the top end of everything way too much. But honestly, the biggest thing for me is the vocals, man. The vocals don't sound good. Like, it sounds like you drown them in reverb because you know they don't sound good and you're trying to find any way to make them sound better. Like, you gotta get a better performance out of the singer, because that's not it. Like, especially in vocals, like, you need to nail the vocal performance. The vocal performance is probably the most important thing out of anything. If you don't get the best possible vocal performance that the singer is capable of doing, the song isn't going to be great. You can have great sounding instruments, you can have a great mix, but if the vocals suck, like, that's it. And I'm not even saying the singer's necessarily, like, not good. I think they just probably need to be coached a little bit better. They need somebody to pull a good performance out of them. I see this happen a lot when people record themselves. They settle for vocal takes, and the vocal especially. Like, you shouldn't settle for any takes, but especially the vocal. You cannot settle on a vocal take. You need to get the best possible version of the vocal that you can get. And that's where a good producer comes in. A good producer can pull an amazing performance out of a vocalist. Even a vocalist that may not be, you know, like an A-list vocalist, as long as you're halfway decent, a really good producer can take you from an okay vocal to an incredible, emotionally moving vocal performance. So guys, there's nothing wrong with recording yourselves, but like, if you're not hitting the mark, hiring a producer is something you might want to consider doing. This mix was sent in by Max. Honestly, it sounds pretty good so far. There's a couple things I'm noticing that might actually boil down to only one thing, but it feels a little muddy. The snare is definitely not cutting through enough in the top end. The vocals definitely aren't cutting through enough. And honestly, I think that's just because the guitars are too loud. I think if you turn the guitars down a little bit, the snare is going to cut through more. The vocals are going to cut through more. You're going to lose a little bit of the low mid energy from the guitars, so it'll probably clean up the low mids a little bit. You might still need to clean up the low mids a little bit more, especially in like the time effects that you've added to things, like any reverbs and delays. You definitely got to EQ those reverbs and delays to take out some of the low mids out of those, so they're not, you know, just adding mud to the track. It's too soft, but it's heavy and I'm done. Yeah, man, honestly, it's pretty good. I'd say turn the volume of the guitars down a little bit. Probably clean up some mud in the guitars. Definitely clean up some mud in the time effects. You might need to EQ the vocals a little better so they're cutting through the guitars, or you might even need to take a little bit out of certain spots in the guitar so the vocals cut through more. And then maybe just, you know, a high shelf on the snare, you know, maybe like 5 or 6K and up. I don't know, maybe a little bit more compression on the drums, or maybe a little more bus compression so the drums gel better with everything else. But like, that's it. Tonally, it's really close. Like, most of the EQ is pretty good. Most of the levels are pretty good, other than the guitar being just a little bit too loud. But honestly, it's a pretty solid mix. It's just those few things. If you clean up those couple things, I think it's going to be a really good mix. This mix was sent in by Robbie. Honestly, man, it sounds pretty good so far. My biggest issue is that 808 sound. Like, it's a little muddy. It might be too much subs, but I don't really think so. If it is, you might want to change which frequency in the low end you boosted. But I think you got to clean up the low mids in that a little bit. And I also feel like, I don't know, maybe add some saturation or something to it. So, you know, add some harmonics so we hear it a little bit more higher up as well. Because, like, we got a little bit of cut through in the top, but it's not really like, but it doesn't really have the grit or like the real upper end cut through that I would expect from a tone like that. So maybe just add some saturation to it, clean up the low mids. Other than that, it's sounding pretty good so far. Yeah, man, honestly, overall, it sounds pretty good. I think it kind of feels like everything is missing some high mid cut through, which it's kind of a vibe, so I wouldn't even necessarily say that that's necessary. But if it were me working on the song, I would definitely have not cut the high mids out of everything as much as you did. That might just be a personal preference thing. Again, like, it's kind of a vibe. I can kind of see it being what it is, but I already want, you know, a little more top end cut through out of the 808s anyway. Like I already said, I want you to add some saturation to the 808s to get some, you know, upper end harmonics to come through a little bit more. So maybe, honestly, maybe just boost the high mid range anywhere from like 1 to like 4 or 5K a little bit across the board, because it does feel a little dark overall. But again, this is kind of a vibe, like, I get it, so maybe not even, like, it might just be personal preference. But if it were me, I would definitely add a little bit more into the top mids than is there. It feels almost like you cut out a bunch of the upper mids to avoid it getting harsh. But if that is what you did, and I think in this case you probably went a little bit overboard with that, I would add some of those high mids back in. But other than that, it's pretty solid. This mix was sent in by Fraser. It sounds pretty good so far. Really, there's only one big problem to me, and that's you're kind of lacking something in the low mids, and you have a little too much low end boominess going on in the kick drum. I think you probably cut the low mids on the kick drum a little too much, and you boosted the subs a little too much in the kick. So bring that sub boost down a little bit, add back in a little bit of the low mids in the kick. You might have also cut a little too much low mids out of the guitar and bass. It's kind of hard to tell, but it definitely feels like it's missing some energy in the low mids. They built it up like this. Okay, the vocals sound really thin and they're not cutting through well at all. It sounds like you did too much processing to the instrumentals first, and then we're having trouble fitting that vocal into that dense mix. It sounds like you cut a lot of low end out of the vocals, which is making it sound super thin, and it's not cutting through well because, first of all, it's super thinned out, but also it's impossible to get that to cut through the guitars the way the guitars are EQ'd. You definitely have a little too much high-end information going on in the guitars. It's starting to get a little harsh up there, so I would back down the high mids and probably the highs as well. Probably everything above like 2K in the guitars could probably come down a bit, and that's going to be the space where your vocal comes in. Now, even though the vocals will be cutting in higher up, you still need to add that low end back into the vocals because it's going to fill it out more, because even then, they're still going to sound thin. They're not going to sound right with how much low end has been removed from the vocal. This mix was sent in by Will. First thing I'm noticing is in the intro, you were missing a lot of low mid information. Then when this palm muted guitar comes in, it gets added back in, but you should definitely still have those low mids present in the intro when the palm mutes aren't going on. The thing with palm muting guitars is, by their nature, they add a lot of low mid information. So if you started mixing this song in a section that had those palm muted guitars, you probably thought that the low mids were fine there, and you didn't go back and adjust that for the parts that the palm mutes weren't adding the low mid information. So in the intro with no palm mutes, it sounds really empty in the low mids, and we're missing a lot of low mid energy. And you need to keep in mind the low mids is where most people are going to be getting that low end energy from on most listening devices. So the low mids are really important. You definitely got to find a way to add those back in the parts where there aren't palm mutes. Alright, I think there's also probably some balance issues, but it's hard to tell. It feels like nothing's really gelling together the way that it should, and that could be a lack of mix bus compression, but it feels like the drums, the guitars, and the bass are completely in their own worlds rather than blending together the way that instruments playing together should. So that generally leads me to believe that, first of all, there's some balance issues. It also probably means you over EQ'd. You probably tried to carve out a different section of the frequency spectrum for each instrument rather than allowing them to overlap and blend together a little bit. So work on your balance a little more. I'd say either the guitars need to come down a bit or the bass needs to come up, because it feels like the drums are a little too far in the background but it also feels like the bass is a little too far in the background. It's kind of hard to tell. So either bring the bass up or the guitars down would be my best bet for how to make things blend together a little bit more. That, and also you need to add some mix bus compression, or if you already have some, add some more, adjust a little bit more so it feels like all these things are really blending together. Because again, right now they all feel like completely separate things. They don't feel like they belong together.